Hey folks, welcome back to this video. So I have my cluster up and running, right? And if you want to know how I did this, I'd recommend watching this video which says build a hybrid Kubernetes cluster for GPU workloads. So following this video, I'm at this stage. So when I'm at this stage, I have everything up and running. And then when I try to talk to my bot asking how close are we to AZI, I get temporary failure in memory resolution. So probably we're not that close, right? But jokes aside, it's not the bot problem, it's my problem. So as you can see in the screenshot, I got failure in name resolution. That kind of tells me that something is wrong in my network stack, right? So to understand from a high level, all I'm doing here is that I have a service for each of my pods. So to talk to the pod, you talk to the service. From my UI pod, I was sending some traffic to the vLLM pod, but then that traffic request failed, right? So to understand what failed, let's understand my cluster setup a little bit. So let's go through this now. And I have two different nodes in my cluster. My worker node has the Kubelet IP of 100.110.80.77. So that's the IP I got from my Tailscale. But then my control node has a completely different Kubelet IP, right? That IP is my local IP. It's not the IP from Tailscale. So that was the first thing I noticed. My worker node and my control node are on completely different IP for the kubelet. So the kubelet is not using the IP of Tailscale. Because of that, from my worker node, I can't talk to my control node at all. If I run this command here, kubectl get nodes -o white. So let me clear this, and then you can see that Vast worker is on the Tailscale IP. So if I do Tailscale IP-4, you'll see that IP, which is the Tailscale. And then if I do Tailscale IP-4, that is my Tailscale IP, but it's not using that, right? So even though it's in the same cluster, right, my API server is exposed using the Tailscale IP. So both of these nodes are in the same cluster, but the kubelet in this node is in a completely different IP address, right? So that's the first problem I noticed here. And then the first fix would be to bring this IP to the same Tailscale IP, right? Because if I try to ping this IP from my worker node, it's not going to work at all. But before I go to the fix, I kind of want to talk more about why this problem happened. So if you notice here, right, I have my UI pod and my API pod in the exact same node, in my worker node. So even though these pods are in the same node, the network communication between these two pods failed. So if you look at the etc/resolve.conf in these pods, you will see that we use the name server 10.96.0.10. So that's the DNS server, right? Any DNS query that it needs to resolve, it will send traffic to that particular IP address. And when my UI pod tries to talk to my API pod, I don't use the IP address. I use the name of the service. So to resolve the name of the service, like I need to resolve that DNS query, right? So that can be only done by the core DNS pod, and which lives in control plane. And we noticed that my worker node kubelet IP is in Tailscale network, but then the kubelet IP in my control node is in my local network. These machines can't talk to each other. Because of that, when a UI pod had to send a DNS query to the DNS server there, it tried to send that query, but that failed, right? It never went to the kube DNS service. So because of that, I could not resolve my, because of that, like I could not talk to my vLLM pod, right? So if it would have worked, the flow would look something like this. From a high level, like my UI pod will send a DNS query to, it'll send a DNS query to the kube DNS service, which is on 10.96.0.10. And then once it gets that, then it will send that to the core DNS pod. So now this core DNS pod has all the DNS related information. It'll say that, okay, you need to talk to the vLLM API service. Here you go. That's the IP address that you need to use. And then it uses that, and then it can, talk to the vLLM API pod, right? So, but that flow did not happen in my case, because any traffic that was being sent from my UI pod to the core DNS service, right, that failed, because node to node communication was impossible because of them being in completely different IP. So, okay, let's let me show you the pods as well, right? Kubectl get pods, kubectl get pods hyphen or wide grep vLLM. So as I said, both of these pods are in my worker node, and still it failed because we can see that in my UI. If I have any other, if I send this query again, I should have gotten a response back by now. It's still stuck. It's trying to fail. It does probably does a couple of retries, and then once it fails, then I get that error message that says resolution failure, right? So to fix this problem, what I need to do is, first of all, I need to change my, I need to go here, sudo vim etc default kubelet. So I need to tell Kubelet that I should be using my Tailscale IP. To do that, just add this line here, kubelet underscore extra rx, and then that's the node IP that Tailscale will use. So I will go ahead and edit that. And if I run kubectl get nodes hyphen o wide, you see that it's the old IP, right? It's not the Tailscale IP. My Tailscale IP is 216.68. And if you look at the change we made it here using the Tailscale IP. So let's go back. Let's restart Kubelet and okay. So let's get that done. Okay, so Kubelet has restarted. So now what I should see is that my control plane will be using my Tailscale IP, right? So it should not be using my local IP anymore. Okay, there we go. So now you can see that I have my Tailscale IP. Both of the nodes are in Tailscale IP, and I should be able to talk to the control node now with no issues. Let me copy that IP address here. And you can see I'm getting response from my ping back, right? So now it should work. And because we have seen that I have established a node-to-node communication. So this was the previous query that failed. So now let me send the query after fixing the node-to-node communication. And I have both of the nodes in same network, right? Both of them are in Tailscale. But notice this, that it's still not resolving. It's taking way longer. It shouldn't take this long. And it's going to fail eventually, right? So that was the other problem that I had. So problem number one, control node was in a completely different IP. Solution, bring that, change the kubelet config to say that use Tailscale IP for kubelet. After even changing that, it still fails. So the second part of the solution is what I noticed, or like I kind of learned this about Tailscale, is that so Tailscale will only forward UDP and TCP packets. Anything apart from that, it will drop it. In my setup, I have my worker node from Vast.ai, and then I have my control node, which is my local desktop. I have these two nodes connected using the Tailscale fabric, right? But in our Kubernetes cluster, we're using Calico as our CNI, my networking interface. So Calico uses IPIP, which is IP in IP encapsulation. This is a raw IP protocol, right? So any traffic that is forwarded by Calico, it encapsulates using the IP protocol 4. But Tailscale will only forward UDP and TCP packets. So even though Calico has that set up, Tailscale is not going to forward any of those packets. It's going to drop, right? As we can see here, that was the other query that I have. Even after resolving the IP address issue on both of my nodes, it still fails, right? So maybe I'll change my query to something else, like how many days are there in a leap year? So that's the reason why my traffic is still failing, because of the encapsulation. So to change this, what I had to do was I had to patch a custom resource called IPPool and tell it to use VXLAN. So what VXLAN does is that it encapsulates the packet using UDP. So we know that Tailscale will now forward UDP and TCP packets, so we won't have the same problem again. And briefly to talk about how the packets would look. Say your normal UDP packet, you'll have your Tailscale auto header, and then you have the UDP header, and then the payload. That is perfectly fine for Tailscale. It will forward it. But if we use IPIP, same Tailscale, and then you have the IP protocol 4 header, and then you have your inner packet. But since this is not a UDP or TCP packet, Tailscale is going to drop it. But then when we use VXLAN, everything stays quite similar, but now you have a UDP header added and some VXLAN related info. And Tailscale will forward this because it is using UDP for encapsulation, right? So after fixing this problem, then I was able to kind of establish my pod-to-pod communication. So again, coming back, problem number one was my kubelet using the local IP, not my Tailscale IP. Changed that, and then node-to-node communication was established. We saw that by using ping. After that, I had another problem of wrong encapsulation in my setup. So Tailscale will only forward UDP TCP. Mine was using IPIP. I had to patch it so that the communication worked. So we see that even after node-to-node communication, the traffic is still failing, right? So let's fix this now. Okay, so going back to my pod here, let me do this. For example, let's look at some examples on how the communication fails as well. For example, if I get my UI pod, that is my UI pod chars 6 CHR. Let me actually increase that CHRC6. So let's look at the etsuresolve.conf, right? That was the DNS server address that each of my pod will have in our cluster. And then that is the kube DNS IP. So if I do kubectl get service -n kube system, we see that 10.96.0.10, that is the kube DNS service. And then, that IP is used by these pods as their name server. So now an example would be to see the DNS failures from the CLI, right? So I will exec into my UI pod, and let me exec into my UI pod. And let's try to talk to the vLLM API service, and this should fail. Okay, it says that wget is not installed. Okay, I might just use the default Python because probably wget packages are not installed in the container. So let me change that here. Okay, and let's copy that. Okay, so this kind of checks that if I'm able to reach to core DNS at all from my pod, right? So I exec to the vLLM UI pod. After I exec to the vLLM UI pod, I try to establish a connection to the kube DNS service, which is on 10.96.0.10 on port 53. You see that it's unreachable, even though my node-to-node communication works, right? Which we confirmed. And so to fix this, I need to patch the IPPool object. So let's look at that again. API resources. So if you do kubectl API resources and grep for Calico, you will see that there is this object called, there's this custom object called IPPool. So let's get the YAML for that, IPPools. Okay, so if I get the YAML, you can see that IPIP mode is set to always, and then VXLAN mode is set to never, right? So we need to patch this so that we set IPIP to never and VXLAN to always. So let's get that done. Okay, so now the YAML should be changed, and you can see that VXLAN mode is set to always, IPIP is set to never. So after this, let's do a rollout restart of my Calico pods. So kubectl rollout restart daemon set Calico kube system. Okay, so let me look at the pods and FNM kube system. Okay, so my core DNS pods are up, but I want to say my Calico as well. And okay, so both of my Calico pods are up. This one is 0x1, so let's just wait until it's 1x1. Okay, so both of the Calico pods are back up, right? And we have changed the config from IPIP mode to VXLAN mode. So the same exact query where I exec into my vLLM UI pod should work now. So here I'm trying the exact same thing. Try to talk to my core DNS. That should hopefully resolve. Okay, there we go. So now before we can see that it was unreachable, right? I was not able to talk to my core DNS from my pod. It printed core DNS unreachable, but now that connection is being established and it says it's reachable.